This is a production of Cornell University.
So yeah, hi everyone. I'm Pete Selby. I am the BrAPI project coordinator and a team of one on the BrAPI project officially. And I'm here to talk about the BrAPI project as well as a little bit the broader scope of system integration and interoperability. So yeah, we'll start there. So there's lots of different ways to connect systems to make sure they work together. Um, and I see, one axis of this is on a scale of automation, like how automatically do systems connect to each other and are interoperable between each other. And so on one side, you've got, flat files or paper files that you're sharing with each other and sharing data between different organizations and different systems. On the other side, you've got complete data federation where every tool knows how to talk to every other tool, and all data is available everywhere all the time. And most systems nowadays end up somewhere in the middle. So what one of the goals of the BrAPI project is to try and sort of push the breeding environments and the scientific environment into more of an automated data sharing system. Yeah, so like I said, this is what a lot of the systems looked like when I first came on board in terms of interoperability. They were somewhat interoperable, but it was a lot of manual effort. So yeah, you can see I would consider these two applications interoperable. You can share data between them and you can, make them work together, but it's kind of a hassle. You're, exporting, some sort of Excel file, some flat file from one system, maybe manipulating that manually along the way so that it can be imported into another system. This works, but it's slow and error prone and just sort of ugly. So yeah, and then sort of thinking about that, talking about the different types of interoperability. Again, this is sort of another dimension of this problem, talking about semantic interoperability, making sure that the words and the data mean the same thing. That's really important for humans and scientists to understand each other. There's a lot of work in that area and in ontologies and that sort of thing. But then as you sort of go down, looking at syntactic and protocol interoperability, this is looking at the structure of the data and the protocol in which it's transferred. We as humans are pretty good at sort of just figuring that out. If you've got two pieces of data that are structured slightly differently, but they look the same thing, they look like the same thing, as a human, we can just sort of figure that out. That's a lot tougher problem for software. So that's sort of one of the areas we're trying to address with the BrAPI project, is getting some standards around the syntax and the protocols for moving data back and forth so it can happen more automatically. Okay, so what is the breeding API, the BrAPI project? So BrAPI is a standardized RESTful web service API specification for communicating breeding data. And I'll jump into each one of those terms just so we all have a clear baseline of what we're talking about here. So starting with an API, what's an API? So all of us are familiar with interacting with a user interface when we're talking about software. This might be a graphical user interface or some command line or whatever, but it's how you as a person, as a user, interact with a piece of software, give it data, receive data back, give it commands, that sort of thing. An API is exactly the same set of functionality, but designed to be from one system to another, one piece of software to another. So the one piece of software can issue commands to another, send data, retrieve data, all programmatically through an API. But it does exactly the same set of tools and interactions that you might need for a user interface. Yeah, next we'll talk about web services. Web services, pretty straightforward. It's a service available on a web. Yeah, generally speaking, web services sort of take this form in the cartoon on the right here. You've got some service consumer, often called a client. You've got a service provider, often called a server. And you're building a request, sending the request across some network to the service provider. Service provider chews on that request and spits out some response that goes back to the service consumer. So this typically with web services, not always, but typically with web services, you'll have this loop of communication, the request response loop for every interaction between the two systems. And yeah, restfulness. So REST stands for representational state transfer. Don't need to worry about remembering that. Everyone just calls it REST. But it is a flavor of web service. There are a couple of different flavors of web service, but REST is by far the most popular right now. REST is built on the well-known HTTP standards. So all the same underlying functionality and protocols that you use to browse the web every day. REST just builds right on top of that, but instead of passing web pages back and forth, it's passing data back and forth. And typically that data is represented as JSON and JSON data structures. It doesn't have to be, but when we're talking about BrAPI, BrAPI defines everything in terms of JSON. So that's what we'll be talking about going forward. So that's sort of the technical part of the BrAPI definition. This is the really important part that I try to emphasize on every talk that I give. BrAPI is a standardized specification. So it's a defined set of standard data models and structures for communicating this sort of data. That standard is defined and maintained by the community that uses it. At its core, BrAPI is a technical specification. So that's a really important piece to understand, and something that I used to get, back in 2017 when I was first taking on this, people were asking me like, "Oh, give me the tool, give me a link to download BrAPI so I can be BrAPI compliant." I was like, it doesn't work like that. We're just we're just looking at a specification, a set of technical documents that outline what the standard is. It's up to you to go, implement it in your own system, in your own tool, connect it in, whatever way you develop your software. And so I try to make this point really strongly every presentation I get to, get the right message across about what BrAPI is. Now, that said, there is, as Kelly mentioned, a large community around BrAPI. There are tools that are already built to help implement the specification. There are lots of tools available, for reading and writing and interacting with the specification already. So you don't have to start from scratch. But this is sort of the key, the core component of BrAPI is just this technical spec. Yeah, so if we look at the specification as a whole, it's a little bit difficult to see on the slides, I think. Maybe the one on the left is a little clearer to see. But yeah, so this is a high-level picture of all the different concepts that BrAPI supports, the different domains. We broke it up into these 4 different modules: core, which mostly talks about trial and study management; germplasm talks about everything germplasm; genotyping, everything genotyping; and phenotyping, everything phenotyping. We broke it up into these 4 modules purely for organizational sake. They all interact the same way. All these different objects, interact with each other. You can see the different connections across the different modules, but it was a lot easier to keep things organized and keep myself sane when I'm looking for stuff within the specification. And yeah, you can see the variety of different topics and concepts. Each one of these concepts listed up here has a full set of metadata associated with it. It's all part of the specification. And I'll emphasize this at the end. On BrAPI.org, our website, you can go look at the full specification and dive down into each one of these elements to see sort of the full set of metadata buried in each one of them. Okay, so roughly how does this work? So yeah, we talked about that request response loop earlier for sort of a generic web service. This is sort of a typical picture of what you might find for 2 applications interacting via BrAPI. And I have bolded here a couple of different sections. So these 2 application stacks, applications are typically built in layers. So you've got the client application, which has maybe some user interface that you're interacting with, some controller, and then these 2 bolded sections here is the request builder and the response handler. These 2 pieces are responsible for taking the internal data structures of the client application and mapping them to the BrAPI specification version. So whatever you use internally, you keep using that internally for your own stuff, but as soon as you're trying to send a request out, you need to map it, transform it into the BrAPI structure, send out that request with the HTTP service. That's going to hit the API layer of the service application, of the server-side application, and be consumed. And then again, we've got this object mapping layer, which is responsible for doing the reverse, taking the BrAPI object that it's received in JSON and converting it, mapping it to whatever they use internally for their own data structure. So these 2 applications don't have to use the same types of data structures. They don't have to be written in the same programming language, because the data is being transferred using this standard, written in JSON and transferred over HTTP. They just need to have this mapping layer to convert from their own internal standard to the BrAPI spec. And then again, the reverse happens on the response. So the server chews on the request, does something about it, sends a response back, maps it into BrAPI, sends the BrAPI response back, and the client response handler knows how to consume that, read that as BrAPI, and turn it into its own internal spec. So that's, there are lots of different use cases we'll talk about later, about how you can put these sorts of things together and what these 2 applications might look like. But this is sort of the general flow of mapping BrAPI data structures back and forth. Okay, so yeah, let's talk about why do we need BrAPI. We're back to this manual interoperability cartoon I have here. Yeah, we've already sort of discussed this. It's slow and messy and potentially insecure depending on where you're putting these files. So let's change the picture a little bit and try and automate this. So now we've got a lot less user interaction. A lot less users are touching the data to manipulate it in any way. We've got our BrAPI layers here. And now just from the second application, our user can request data from the first application. It gets automatically mapped, transferred, and mapped again. And now the user can interact with that data however it needs to. And we don't even need to store it here. In this previous picture, we're basically making a copy of the data, storing it somewhere else so that we can manipulate it. Here, we can transfer the data. It can live on the first application and stay there. And the user can use it, interact with it, maybe store off a copy if they need to, but it's not required anymore. They can, maybe they're just trying to read the data. Maybe it's just for reference. Maybe, they just need to perform some calculation and then store that calculation. Whatever it is, they don't need to make a copy of it, and it flows automatically. So you can do this sort of setup with any API. That the API is itself what automates this process and this data flow between the two applications. The extra little piece that BrAPI brings is the standard specification. So now we can swap out one application for another, and it should still work exactly the same because all these applications are talking the same language using the BrAPI specification. And we can swap it out for a different type of application. It's some sort of data warehouse in this case instead of another website. Whatever it is, because they're all talking the same data structures, talking the same language, we can easily interchange those out. I should say, in theory. This doesn't always work in practice, but it's a good starting point. Yeah, so let's talk about some of the applications and impacts that we've had already. There are a number of solved use cases, and the ones I put up on the screen here, there are a bunch of solved use cases, but the ones I put up on the screen here were specifically, these were specifically chosen from our first grant, our first funding grant. We set out, to try and solve a small set of use cases with BrAPI and say, these are the ones we're definitely going to tackle, and we succeeded. So these are the 3 or 4 that we, originally set out for and succeeded on. There are, lots of other use cases now, and we'll look at that in a second. But these are some of the basic ones. So first of all, looking at data collection. So did a lot of work with the KSU Fieldbook folks, PhenoApps as they're now called, and basically adding BrAPI capabilities to the Fieldbook app. So now people in the field, they can, just from the app, they can download direct from whatever database they're using, get the field layout and everything downloaded right into their, and all the traits they're working on downloaded right into their app. They go out, collect whatever data they need, press a button, and it all gets pushed back up to the server. This is sort of the primary example of the manual data transfer I was talking about earlier, where they used to have to download a file, put it on some cloud service or email it to themselves, bring it onto their phone, upload it into the app, and then reverse that process to get it back to the server. So yeah, that was a big win to be able to do that automatically via BrAPI. This is another one in terms of sample management, managing samples specifically going off to some genotyping lab, and making sure that the sample metadata remains consistent between all the different labs and applications that are involved in this. We worked with a couple of different genotyping labs to make sure we had the right standards that would interact with their systems, built these data structures so that from some sample management tool, you could send all the metadata automatically along with your physical shipment of samples to whatever lab. They would have all the metadata, exact copy of whatever you had, and then that copy of sample metadata could also go to your genotyping database, wherever you're storing your final genotype results, along with some automated functionalities to get the results from the lab to the database, wherever that might live. So that was a big success. This is one that's still being actively worked on and implemented right now. The basic idea being pulling data from a number of different data sources into some kind of analytics engine, run your models, your calculations, whatever you're trying to do, and provide an output. So again, just trying to avoid moving physical files into some sort of calculation engine, and have this be an automated flow. So when you've got regular breeding processes that you're going to run these same calculations every year, every month, whatever, you've got this automated flow to just do it at a press of a button, pull the data in, run your analytics, and present the report. Like I said, there's a couple of different projects actively working on this right now, and setting up this type of functionality. And finally, the BrAPs. So BrAPs, I had been working on the BrAPI project for maybe 6 months, and Lucas Mueller came running into my office, and he just stood in my doorway and went, "We need BrAPs," and then ran away. And I said, "What?" But it turned out to be a really good idea once I caught him and had him explain. So the concept around BrAPs is they're little self-contained applications that run entirely on the BrAPI spec. And so someone can write, a lot of them are written in JavaScript. They don't have to be, but a lot of them are little JavaScript web apps that you can just plug into your own website. And as long as you've got the BrAPI data sources implemented that the app requires, you have this new functionality. So yeah, different visualizations, pedigree viewer, sort of the one buried there is plot mapper, over a real geolocation. So yeah, these were really cool. And one of the other cool things about this is it touches on sort of a big data concept where instead of moving your data, let your data live where it is, because it's really big and a pain to move. Instead, bring your applications, bring your software to the data. And so this was another, we're not just sharing data within the BrAPI community, we're actually sharing applications, because those are a lot easier to move and to implement other places. So this was a really cool concept that we've been developing, and there are a number of BrAPs available now, and a few more that are being developed by various members of the community. Yeah, and I'll quickly touch on, I mentioned there's a lot more use cases within the community right now. These are some of them. There's a whole page on BrAPI.org that lists out the compatible software that people have volunteered to register. There's still more that people haven't put on there yet. But yeah, we've started building a list of all the different compatible software packages and applications that are BrAPI compatible right now. So yeah, I encourage you to go check that out on BrAPI. It should be pretty easy to find the compatible software page. And none of this would be possible without the BrAPI community. So I'll end on sort of an overview of the BrAPI community. We've got roughly 37 partner organizations, registered partner organizations. It's really easy to become a partner organization. You send me the logo for your organization and I put it on the website, and there you are, you're registered. Yeah, roughly 200 to 250 plant breeders, software developers, data managers, other expert scientists in their field, all working together, building the software that's compatible, helping build the standards. We really need to come. We really needed to come together as a community to decide on what these standards were, make sure that they're useful for everyone. That's one of my rules. If someone comes to me with a new idea for a new concept or new piece of metadata they want to add to the standard, I try and tease out of them first, is this going to be useful for you, or is this going to be useful for everyone else? And usually if I can find 2 or 3 different organizations that all agree that yes, this new piece would be useful, then we'll start working on adding it. If it's just one group saying, oh, we need this thing in the spec, then maybe we'll hold off until it becomes more useful. Yeah, we also have a full advisory board, 6 elected officials from members of the community make up that advisory board, and they're one of the driving forces that sort of represent the community, help me make quick decisions on building out the spec. They're one of the resources I go to when I'm I'm not an expert in plant breeding. I'm a software guy. So if there are questions on the science of it or what makes sense, how to construct the spec, they're generally the group that I go to first. This is a slide I like showing, just showing the different organizations that we've worked with. Kelly wasn't joking when he said, traveling all over the world, visiting these different groups and the different science and the different software they're all producing. It's very exciting to see it all on one global map. And finally, the hackathons. So one of the primary ways that this community gets together and stays together is through hackathons. We run hackathons about twice a year. Post-COVID, we're doing one in person and one virtual each year. And yeah, this was an opportunity for all of these folks to get together, talk in person, build projects with each other. During that week, the hackathons are usually a week long, and we all get to see each other in person and build all these different tools together and talk about the specification and come up with new ideas. Our most recent in-person hackathon was this past spring in South Carolina. Our most recent hackathon at all was actually a virtual one that just wrapped up at the end of October. It's tough to get group photos from virtual hackathons, though. Yeah, and a bunch of resources here if anyone's interested in learning more. Like I said, all of this is available on BrAPI.org. Yeah, there's a contact page. You can join our mailing list or our Slack channel if you want to get more involved. And I'll leave it there if there are any questions. That's a good question. So generally speaking, there needs to be a mapping layer because we're usually working with systems that already exist and we're adding BrAPI to them. So we don't want to redesign their whole storage system just to make them compatible. So most of the time we're talking about mapping and making things compatible. There are a couple of projects going on now, somewhat recent projects where people are taking the BrAPI specification and adapting it for a database schema, basically. And then in that way, it's a much more direct translation. And so there's some of these projects where you can like download um, the BrAPI schema database, and it'll spin up a full database with all the BrAPI compatibilities built into it. But that, again, that's starting a new database from scratch, which not everyone is interested in doing. So some of both. Yeah.
So is like toothpaste for database.
You can pretty much plug in whatever you want. BreedBase and the BreedBase crew, they've been part of the project since the beginning. And so it's sort of interesting that different groups have different approaches to implementing BrAPI. So BreedBase, what they opted for was full implementation of the BrAPI spec, just get it all out there and ready. Other databases are saying, selecting, well, for this specific use case, we only need these 5 BrAPI calls, so those are the 5 we're going to implement. So, it has pluses and minuses. So BreedBase has a full suite of BrAPI endpoints, but some of them haven't been tested yet. Some of them just aren't used ever, versus, BMS has a more concrete set that are well tested, but it's a smaller set of endpoints. Yeah, and there's a number of different databases, and hopefully more adding as we go forward. So a lot of, I would say most of the time, people have an existing database they're working with. And, that'll either be a database that I've worked with before, and so they have some BrAPI compatibility already, or it'll be a new database, and I'll try and start working with them to get them the compatibility. There have been a couple of times where people have come to me asking for recommendations for database, and I try to stay very neutral. Yeah, no. I try to stay very neutral, and I lay out sort of the pluses and minuses of each of the systems that are within the community, trying to get a feel for what they're working on and what would best fit their situation. So I really try to stay very neutral there. Yeah.
Let's say I run some service into the and you mentioned that BrAPI is a technical specification. It's not a software. It's not like, let's say I run some service and I want to make my service BrAPI or compliant.
Mhm.
Can I turn to somebody and say, hey, can you help me with this? And the case I'm thinking of is the USDA genotyping labs. There are these small range genotyping labs. You have to submit Excel spreadsheets to them and stuff like that. Personally, I don't know to the extent to which the genotyping lab manager agreed with me, but I just don't know if they were
Yeah.
But how do you get?
That's a great question. So first would become talk to me and see if I can help out. I do have some spare development time that I can, I can assist people getting started, but I can't maintain every system. Uh, um, they they had the resources, and yeah, in particular, so we worked with them and Dart to try and build the initial standard together, trying to make the standard that would work for both of those systems, and then expand it as other groups came on board. And so that they got it just because they were they were the guinea pigs to help develop this. It shouldn't take too much effort to become BrAPI compatible. One of the biggest time sinks is the concept mapping, which isn't, a technical activity. That's, that's a sit down with a whiteboard and map concepts, and map names, and terms. And that's definitely something that I can help with. And so yeah, basically just sitting down saying, okay, what does your system look like? What does BrAPI look like? And figure out what that is. Then actually implementing that code is pretty straightforward once you get a sense for what the mapping is. And T3 is breed based now, right? I don't know if it's being used right now, but there was some work in breed based to actually connect it up to like Cornell genotyping and that. So one half of that problem is solved already. So there is one endpoint that I ask everyone implement, and that's called server info. And basically that tells people what BrAPI endpoints that they have implemented. So if I joked the first time, way back when I built my first test BrAPI server to just sort of get a handle on it, I made a single server info endpoint and said, I don't serve any other BrAPI endpoints, and said, look, I'm BrAPI compliant. So that's like the bare minimum. And then I don't really want there to be a core set, because everyone's got different needs. Everyone's using it in slightly different ways in different use cases. So as long as they've got that one endpoint telling the rest of the world which ones they are compatible with and what version they're compatible with and all that sort of thing, I think that's fine. It's been fine so far. And I really try to, one of the other questions people come to me with is which metadata fields in the spec are required. And there are actually very few metadata fields within the specification that are required from a BrAPI point of view, because each different use case is going to require different fields. So, most of those fields aren't required, but if you want to connect to Fieldbook's got its own set of BrAPI fields that it reads from. And so those are going to be required if you're trying to connect to Fieldbook, that sort of thing. So that flexibility has worked well so far. Yeah.
The specific question is, do you know of any BrAPs that do experimental design for like building field trial? But the general question is, like, so for R packages, you're looking for an R package that X, Google it, or is there some other search function for BrAPs so that the search function has here?
That's definitely one of the search functions. Ask me or join our Slack and sort of ask the community, in general. The compatible software page has a search function in it. So all the different, and this is something I'm actively pushing the community towards, is getting their software posted on there, because I know that there are tools and applications that aren't on the website yet, but I just have to track people down and get all the information I need to put them on there. So actively working on that to sort of expand that set. But yeah, I mean, those, if you're just looking for some tool to do something, those are going to be the first few places to look. And then, we might find a tool that's similar or close, and then it's working with those developers or whoever to expand on that. Any other questions? Yeah, Star. Yeah, so that's a good question. So for most of the end users who aren't interested in programming, yeah, they're going to benefit most from the different tools and capabilities and sort of the automated interoperability between these different systems. So in theory, they shouldn't even know that BrAPI exists or that that's happening in the background. Um, one of the other ways, though, is I know you know this, but Khaled is working on a tool called QBMS, which is an R package that basically takes the BrAPI endpoints and wraps them in something that a breeder is more familiar with, or you know, a R developer is more familiar with. And so the QBMS package is designed to be able to basically get data automatically into your R scripts, whatever you're trying to develop, without knowing all the inner workings of BrAPI happening on in the background, but still using that to get all that data from a database. So yeah, couple of different options there in terms of what the users might know about in terms of BrAPI.
Question related from computer office side.
Yeah.
Enterprises and still is a BrAPI maintenance volume is analyze pipeline still build one BrAPI top.
So yeah, it depends. We did, you know, put a lot of thought into efficiency. It's always a balancing act between, you know, making data access efficient versus flexible. So yeah, you can get you know, a very efficient data pipeline, but not have many options in terms of what you actually want to query. So we're always trying to keep that balance of making the BrAPI endpoints flexible, but also efficient. And I think for the most part we've hit it, but you know, different use cases may be easier or harder depending on what exactly you're trying to do. You know, we have you know, as you know, we've worked with some enterprise systems already, and you know, trying to get sort of larger scale data flows going. And there are some techniques that have actually been added to later versions of the spec to make that a little bit easier and a little bit more efficient in terms of how data is being transferred. And that's something I'm always keeping an eye out for is fixing those sorts of problems within the specification. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Different versions of the specification. Yeah. So we try to, so basically there's each BrAPI version is has a major and a minor version. So the current version of BrAPI is 2.1 right now. Try to keep backwards compatibility maintained for all the minor versions, but major versions might lose some of that backwards compatibility. So as long as someone's working in the 2.x range, then all the endpoints should be backwards compatible with each other and able to interact. But you know, as soon as you go back to 1 or up to 3 or whatever, then you might lose some of that compatibility. So trying to keep ranges of compatibility, but still be able to progress the specification. All right. Any other questions? Yeah. Say again. Yeah, so there's metadata for defining locations and sort of defining the different environment. We don't, you know, there are plenty of APIs and specification for weather data already. We didn't want to reinvent that wheel, so it's more about identifying the location and the type, you know, sort of the general type of environment, and then adding connectors to, you know, say specific weather data or that sort of thing. But yeah, it is part of the specification to define this is where I am, this is the general type of environment that I'm dealing with. So nothing in the spec specifically for microbiomes yet, but that's just because no one in the community has approached me about adding it. So this is how new concepts get added to BrAPI is someone says, I have a new use case, but I really need this microbiome data to be part of it to make it effective. I bring that to the wider community. Somebody else goes, oh yeah, that would be really useful. And then, we work together to build out the specification and add it to the spec. So it's a somewhat slow process to add things to the actual specification. As a software engineer, my biggest concern is to make working software. So if you've got a use case that needs microbiome data, that uses BrAPI everywhere else, but you need this extra little piece, just go add the extra little piece. We'll catch up with the specification later, and you'll have a slightly modified BrAPI endpoint for handling your data, doing whatever you need to do to talk to this other system. And then, that in itself, if you've got a working system that has a modified data structure, that proves to me that yes, this data structure can work for this use case, and that's even more proof to add it to the rest of the spec for the community. So yeah, nothing about microbiomes yet, but yeah, if you've got a use case that the wider community be interested in, let me know. Right. Yeah. So yeah, like I said, we have a general sense of what the environment is. So we've got a general soil type and sort of what's going on, but nothing that specific. And sort of depending on what you're trying to do, there's a pretty robust system for making observations and tying that to ontologies. So you might, have some observation, some trait or some variable defined as like the soil content or some piece of the microbiome, whatever, some trait that you're measuring in the field regularly. Those measurements could definitely be recorded within the BrAPI spec, but sort of not defined as its own concept, just as more not phenotypic, but just more observation data collected as part of a study.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.